Welcome everybody to the House of Air Book Club. Today we are reading Pawn of Prophecy by David Eddings, Chapter 1. Part 1, Cinderia. Chapter 1. The first thing the boy Garion remembered was the kitchen at Fowler's farm. For all the rest of his life he had a special warm feeling for kitchens, and those peculiar sounds and smells that seemed somehow to combine into a bustling seriousness that had to do with love and food and comfort and security, and above all, home. No matter how high Garion rose in life, he never forgot that all his memories began in that kitchen. The kitchen at Fowler's farm was a large, low-beamed room filled with ovens and kettles and great spits that turned slowly in cavern-like arched fireplaces. There were long, heavy work tables where bread was kneaded into loaves and chickens were cut up and carrots and celery were diced with quick, crisp, rocking movements of long, curved knives. When Garion was very small, he played under those tables and soon learned to keep his fingers and toes out from under the feet of the kitchen helpers who worked around them. And sometimes, in the late afternoon when he grew tired, he would lie in a corner and stare into one of the flickering fires that gleamed and reflected back from the 100 polished pots and knives and long-handled spoons that hung from pegs along the whitewashed walls, and, all bemused, he would drift off into sleep in perfect peace and harmony with all the world around him. The corner of the kitchen and everything that happened, there was Aunt Paul. She seemed somehow to be able to be everywhere at once. The finishing touch that plumped a goose in its roasting pan, or deftly shaped a rising loaf, or garnished a smoking ham fresh from the oven was always hers. Though there were several others who worked in the kitchen, no loaf, stew, soup, roast, or vegetable ever went out of it that had not been touched at least once by Aunt Paul. She knew by smell, taste, or some higher instinct what each dish required, and she seasoned them all by pinch or trace or a negligent-seeming shake from earthenware spice-pots. It was as if there was a kind of magic about her, a knowledge and power beyond that of ordinary people, and yet, even at her busiest, she always knew precisely where Garion was. In the very midst of crimping a pie crust, or decorating a special cake, or stitching up a freshly stuffed chicken, she could, without looking, reach out a leg and hook him back under from the feet of the others with heel or ankle. As he grew a bit older, it even became a game. Garion would watch until she seemed far too busy to notice him, and then, laughing, he would run on his sturdy little feet towards a door, but she would always catch him, and he would laugh and throw his arms around her neck and kiss her and then go back to watching for his next chance to run away again. He was quite convinced in those early years that his Aunt Paul was quite the most important and beautiful woman in the world. For one thing, she was taller than the other women on Fowler's farm, nearly as tall as a man, and her face was always serious, even stern, except with him, of course. Her hair was long and very dark, almost black, all but one lock just above her left brow, which was white as new snow. At night, when she tucked him into the little bed close beside her own in their private room above the kitchen, he would reach out and touch that white lock. She would smile at him and touch his face with a soft hand. Then he would sleep, content in the knowledge that she was there, watching over him. Fowler's farm lay very nearly in the center of Cinderia, a misty kingdom bordered on the west by the Sea of the Winds and on the east by the Gulf of Cherok. Like all farmhouses in that particular time and place, Fowler's farmstead was not one building or two, but rather was a solidly constructed complex of sheds and barns and hen roosts and dovecotes, all facing inwards upon a central yard with a stout gate at the front. Along the second-story gallery were the rooms, some spacious, some quite tiny, in which lived the farmhands, who tilled and planted and weeded the extensive fields beyond the walls. Fowler himself lived in quarters in the square tower above the central dining hall, where his workers assembled 3 times a day, sometimes 4 during harvest season, to feast on the bounty of Aunt Paul's kitchen. All in all, it was quite a happy and harmonious place. Farmer Faldor was a good master. He was a tall, serious man with a long nose and an even longer jaw. Though he seldom laughed or even smiled, he was kindly to those who worked for him, and seemed more intent on maintaining them all in health and well-being than extracting the last possible ounce of sweat from them. In many ways, he was more like a father than a master to the 60-odd people who lived in his freeholding. He ate with them, which was unusual, since many farmers in this district sought to hold themselves aloof from their workers, and his presence at the head of the central table in the dining hall exerted a restraining influence on some of the younger ones who tended sometimes to be boisterous. Farmer Faldor was a devout man, and he invariably invoked with simple elegance the blessings of the gods before each meal. The people on his farm, knowing this, filed with some decorum into the dining hall before each meal, and sat in the semblance of at least of piety before attacking the heaping platters and bowls of food that Aunt Paul and her helpers had placed before them. Because of Faldor's good heart and the magic of Aunt Paul's deft fingers, the farm was known throughout the district as the finest place to live and work for 20 leagues in any direction. Whole evenings were spent in the tavern in the nearby village of Upper Grault, in minute descriptions of the near miraculous meals served regularly in Faldor's dining hall. Less fortunate men who worked on other farms were frequently seen, after several pots of ale, to weep openly at descriptions of one of Aunt Paul's roasted geese, and the fame of Faldor's farm spread wide throughout the district. The most important man on the farm, aside from Faldor, was Dernick the smith. As Geryon grew older and was allowed to move out from under Aunt Paul's watchful eye, he found his way inevitably to the smithy. The glowing iron that came from Dernick's forge had an almost hypnotic attraction for him. Dernick was an ordinary-looking man with plain brown hair and a plain face, ruddy from the heat of his forge. He was neither tall nor short, nor was he thin or stout. He was sober and quiet, and like most men who followed his trade, he was enormously strong. He wore a rough leather jerkin and an apron of the same material. Both were spotted with burns from the sparks which flew from his forge. He also wore tight-fitting hose and soft leather boots, as was the custom in that part of Sandaria. At first, Dernick's only words to Geryon were warnings to keep his fingers away from the forge and the glowing metal which came from it. In time, however, he and the boy became friends, and he spoke more frequently. "Always finish what you set your hand to," he would advise. "It's bad for the iron if you set it aside and then take it back to the fire more than it's needful." "Why is that?" Geryon would ask. Dernick would shrug. "It just is." "Always do the very best you can," he said on another occasion, as he put a last few finishing touches with a file on the metal parts of a wagon tongue he was repairing. "But that piece goes underneath," Geryon said. "No one will ever see it." "But I know, if it's there," Dernick said, still smoothing the metal. "If it isn't done as well as I can do it, I'll be ashamed every time I see this wagon go by, and I'll see this wagon every day." And so it went. Without even intending to, Dernick instructed the small boy in those solid Sandarian virtues of work, thrift, sobriety, good manners, and practicality which formed the backbone of the society. At first, Aunt Paul worried about Geryon's attraction to the smithy with its obvious dangers, but after watching from her kitchen door for a while, she realized that Dernick was almost as watchful of Geryon's safety as she was herself, and she became less concerned. "If the boy becomes pestersome, Goodman Dernick, send him away," she told the smith on one occasion when she had brought a large copper kettle to the smithy to be patched. "Or tell me, and I'll keep him closer to the kitchen." "He's no bother, Mistress Pole," Dernick said, smiling. "He's a sensible boy, and knows enough to keep out of the way." "You're too good-natured, friend Dernick," Aunt Paul said. "The boy is full of questions. Answer one, and a dozen more pour out." "That's the way of boys," Dernick said, carefully pouring bubbling metal into the small clay ring he'd placed around the tiny hole in the bottom of the kettle. I was questioned some myself when I was a boy. My father and old Barrel, the smith who taught me, were patient enough to answer what they could. I'd repay them poorly if I didn't have the same patience with Geryon. Geryon, who was sitting nearby, had held his breath during this conversation. He knew that one wrong word on either side would have instantly banished him from the smithy. As Aunt Paul walked across the hard-packed dirt of the yard towards her kitchen with the now-mended kettle, he noticed the way that Dernick watched her, and an idea began to form in his mind. It was a simple idea, and the beauty of it was that it provided something for everyone. "Aunt Paul," he said that night, wincing as she washed one of his ears with a rough cloth. "Yes," she said, turning her attention to his neck. "Why don't you marry Dernick?" She stopped washing. "What?" she asked. "I think it would be an awfully good idea." "Oh, do you?" Her voice had a slight edge to it, and Geryon knew he was on dangerous ground. "He likes you," he said defensively. "And I suppose you've already discussed this with him?" "No," he said. "I thought I'd talk to you about it first." "At least that was a good idea." "I can tell him about it tomorrow morning if you'd like." His head was turned around quite firmly by one ear. Aunt Paul, Geryon felt, found his ears far too convenient. "Don't you so much as breathe one word of this nonsense to Dernick or anyone else," she said, her dark eyes burning into his with a fire he had never seen there before. "It was only a thought," he said quickly. "A very bad one. From now on, leave thinking to grown-ups." She was still holding his ear. "Anything you say," he said hastily. Later that night, however, when they lay in their beds in the quiet darkness, he approached the problem obliquely. "Aunt Paul." "Yes?" "Since you don't want to marry Dernick, who do you want to marry?" "Geryon," she said. "Yes?" "Close your mouth and go to sleep." "I think I've got the right to know," he said in an injured tone. "Geryon." "All right, I'm going to sleep, but I don't think you're being very fair about all this." She drew in a deep breath. "Very well," she said. "I'm not thinking of getting married. I have never thought of getting married, and I seriously doubt I'll ever think of getting married. I have far too many important things to attend to for any of that." "Don't worry, Aunt Paul," he said, wanting to put her mind at ease. "When I grow up, I'll marry you." She laughed then, a deep, rich laugh, and reached out to touch his face in the darkness. "Oh no, my Geryon," she said. "There's another wife in store for you." "Who?" he demanded. "You'll find out," she said mysteriously. "Now go to sleep." "Aunt Paul?" "Yes?" "Where's my mother?" It was a question he had been meaning to ask for quite some time. There was a long pause, then Aunt Paul sighed. "She died," she said quietly. Geryon felt a sudden wrenching surge of grief, an unbearable anguish. He began to cry. And then she was beside his bed. She knelt on the floor and put her arms around him. Finally, a long time later, after she had carried him to her own bed and held him close until his grief had run its course, Geryon asked brokenly, "What did she die? What was she like, my mother?" "She was fair-haired," Aunt Paul said, "and very young, and very beautiful. Her voice was gentle, and she was very happy." "Did she love me?" "More than you can imagine." And then he cried again, but his crying was quieter now, more regretful than anguished. Aunt Paul held him closely until he cried himself to sleep. There were other children on Fowler's farm, as was only natural in a community of 60 or so. The older ones on the farm all worked, but there were 3 other children of about Geryon's age on the freeholding. These 3 became his playmates and his friends. The oldest boy was named Runderig. He was a year or 2 older than Geryon and quite a bit taller. Ordinarily, since he was the eldest of the children, Runderig would have been their leader, but because he was an Arend, his sense was a bit limited, and he cheerfully deferred to the younger ones. The kingdom of Sendaria, unlike other kingdoms, was inhabited by a broad variety of racial stocks. Cherriks, Algars, Drasnians, Arends, and even a substantial number of Tolnedrans had merged to form the elemental Sendar. Arends, of course, were very brave, but were notoriously thick-witted. Geryon's second playmate was Daroon, a small, quick boy whose background was so mixed that he could only be called a Sendar. The most notable thing about Dorun was the fact that he was always running. He never walked if he could run. Like his feet, his mind seemed to tumble over itself, and his tongue as well. He talked continually and very fast, and he was always excited. The undisputed leader of the little foursome was a girl, Zubret, a golden-haired charmer who invented their games, made up stories to tell them, and set them to stealing apples and plums from Falder's orchard for her. She ruled them as a little queen, playing one against the other and inciting them into fights. She was quite heartless, and each of the three boys at times hated her, even while remaining helpless thralls to her tiniest whim. In the winter, they slid on wide boards down the snowy hillside behind the farmhouse, and returned home, wet and snow-covered, with chapped hands and glowing cheeks, as evening's purple shadows crept across the snow. Or, after Dernick the smith had proclaimed the ice safe, they would slide endlessly across the frozen pond that lay glittering frostily in the little dale just to the east of the farm buildings along the road to Upper Grault. And if the weather was too cold, or on towards spring when rain and warm winds had made the snow slushy and the pond unsafe, they would gather in the hay barn and leap by the hour from the loft into the soft hay beneath, filling their hair with chaff and their noses with dust that smelled of summer. In the spring they caught pollywogs along the marshy edges of the pond, and climbed trees to stare in wonder at the tiny blue eggs the birds had laid in twiggy nests in the high branches. It was Dorun, naturally, who fell from a tree and broke his arm one fine spring morning when Zubret urged him into the highest branches of a tree near the edge of the pond. Since Runderig stood helplessly gaping at his injured friend, and Zubret had run away almost before he hit the ground, it fell to Geryon to make certain necessary decisions. Gravely, he considered the situation for a few moments, his young face seriously intent beneath the shock of sandy hair. The arm was obviously broken, and Dorun, pale and frightened, bit his lip to keep from crying. A movement caught Geryon's eye, and he glanced up quickly. A man in a dark cloak sat astride a large black horse not far away, watching intently. When their eyes met, Geryon felt a momentary chill, and he knew that he had seen the man before, that indeed the dark figure had hovered on the edge of his vision for as long as he could remember, never speaking, but always watching. There was in that silent scrutiny a kind of cold animosity, curiously mingled with something that was almost, but not quite, fear. Then Dorun whimpered, and Geryon turned back. Carefully, he bound the injured arm across the front of Dorun's body with his rope belt, and then he and Runderig helped the injured boy to his feet. At least he could have helped, Geryon said resentfully. Who? Runderig said, looking around. Geryon turned to point at the dark-cloaked man, but the rider was gone. I didn't see anyone, Runderig said. It hurts, Dorun said. Don't worry, Geryon said. Aunt Paul can fix it. And so she did. When the three appeared at the door of her kitchen, she took in the situation with a single glance. Bring him over here, she told them, her voice not even excited. She set the pale and violently trembling boy on a stool near one of the ovens, and mixed a tea of several herbs taken from earthenware jugs on a high shelf in the back of one of her pantries. Drink this, she instructed Dorun, handing him a steaming mug. Will it make my arm well? Dorun asked, suspiciously eyeing the evil-smelling brew. Just drink it, she ordered, laying out some splints and linen strips. Ick! It tastes awful, Dorun said, making a face. It's supposed to, she told him. Drink it all. I don't think I want any more, he said. Very well, she said. She pushed back the splints and took down a long, very sharp knife from a hook on the wall. What are you going to do with that? He demanded shakily. Since you don't want to take the medicine, she said blandly, I guess it'll have to come off. Off, Dorun squeaked, his eyes bulging. Probably about right there, she said, thoughtfully touching his arm at the elbow with the point of the knife. Tears coming to his eyes, Dorun gulped down the rest of the liquid, and a few minutes later he was nodding, almost drowsing on his stool. He screamed once, though, when Aunt Pole set the broken bone, but after the arm had been racked and splinted, he drowsed again. Aunt Pole spoke briefly with the boy's frightened mother, and then had Dermot carry him up to bed. "You wouldn't really have cut off his arm," Geryon said. Aunt Pole looked at him, her expression unchanging. "Oh," she said, and he was no longer sure. "I think I'd like to have a word with Mistress Soubrette now," she said then. "She ran away when Daroon fell out of the tree," Geryon said. "Find her." "She's hiding," Geryon protested. "She always hides when something goes wrong. I wouldn't know where to look for her." "Geryon," Aunt Pole said, "I didn't ask you if you knew where to look. I told you to find her and bring her to me." "What if she won't come?" Geryon hedged. "Geryon." There was a note of awful finality in Aunt Pole's tone, and Geryon fled. "I didn't have anything to do with it," Soubrette lied as soon as Geryon led her to Aunt Pole in the kitchen. "You," Aunt Pole said, pointing at a stool. "Sit." Soubrette sank onto the stool, her mouth open and her eyes wide. "You," Aunt Pole said to Geryon, pointing at the kitchen door. "Out." Geryon left hurriedly. 10 minutes later, a sobbing little girl stumbled out of the kitchen. Aunt Pole stood at the doorway, looking after her with eyes as hard as ice. "Did you thrash her?" Geryon asked hopefully. Aunt Pole withered him with a glance. "Of course not," she said. "You don't thrash girls." "I would have," Geryon said, disappointed. "What did you do with her?" "Don't you have anything to do?" Aunt Pole asked. "No," Geryon said. "Not really." That, of course, was a mistake. "Good," Aunt Pole said, finding one of his ears. "It's time you started to earn your way. You'll find some dirty pots in the scullery. I'd like to have them scrubbed." "I don't know why you're angry with me," Geryon objected, squirming. "It wasn't my fault that Daroon went up that tree." "The scullery, Geryon," she said. "Now." The rest of the spring and the early part of summer were quiet. Daroon, of course, could not play until his arm mended, and Soubrette had been so shaken by whatever it was that Aunt Pole had said to her that she avoided the 2 other boys. Geryon was left with only Runderig to play with, and Runderig was not bright enough to be much fun. Because there was really nothing else to do, the boys often went into the fields to watch the hands work and listen to their talk. As it happened, during that particular summer, the men on Felder's farm were talking about the Battle of Vaumimbre, the most cataclysmic event in the history of the West. Geryon and Runderig listened, enthralled, as the men unfolded the story of how the hordes of Kaltorak had quite suddenly struck into the West some 500 years before. It had all begun in 4865, as men reckoned time in that part of the world, when vast multitudes of Murgos and Nadraks and Thuls had struck down across the mountains of the eastern escarpment into Drasnia, and behind them in endless waves had come the uncountable numbers of the Malorians. After Drasnia had been brutally crushed, the Angaraks turned southward into the vast grasslands of Algeria and had laid siege to the enormous fortress called the Algerian Stronghold. The siege had lasted for 8 years until finally, in disgust, Kaltorak had abandoned it. It was not until he turned his army westward into Ulgo land that the other kingdoms became aware that the Angarak invasion was directed not only against the Alorns, but against all of the West. In the summer of 4875, Kaltorak had come down upon the Arendish plain before the city of Vaumimbre, and it was there that the combined armies of the West awaited him. The Sendars who participated in battle were a part of the force under the leadership of Brand, the Riven Warder. That force, consisting of the Rivens, Sendars, and Asturian Arens, assaulted the Angarak rear after the left had been engaged by Algars, Drasnians, and Ulgos, the right by Tolnedrans and Cherriks, and the front by the legendary charge of the Membrate Arens. For hours the battle had raged, until, in the center of the field, Brand had met in a single combat with Kaltorak himself. Upon that duel had hinged the outcome of the battle. Although 20 generations had passed since that titanic encounter, it was still as fresh in the memory of the Sundarian farmers who worked on Falder's farm as if it had happened only yesterday. Each blow was described, and each feint and parry. At the final moment, when it seemed that he must inevitably be overthrown, Brand had removed the covering from his shield, and Kaltorak, taken aback by some momentary confusion, had lowered his guard and had been instantly struck down. For Runderig, the description of the battle was enough to set his horrendous blood seething. Garion, however, found that certain questions had been left unanswered by the stories. "Why was Brand's shield covered?" he asked Kralto, one of the older hands. Kralto shrugged. "It just was," he said. "Everyone I've ever talked with about it agrees on that." "Was it a magic shield?" Garion persisted. "It may have been," Kralto said, "but I've never heard anyone say so. All I know is that when Brand uncovered his shield, Kaltorak dropped his own shield, and Brand stabbed his sword into Kaltorak's head, through the eye, or so I am told." Garion shook his head stubbornly. "I don't understand," he said. "How could something like that have made Kaltorak afraid?" "I can't say," Kralto told him. "I've never heard anyone explain it." Despite his dissatisfaction with the story, Garion quite quickly agreed to Runderig's rather simple plan to reenact the duel. After a day or so of posturing and banging at each other with sticks to simulate swords, Garion decided that they needed some equipment to make the game more enjoyable. 2 kettles and 2 large pot lids mysteriously disappeared from Aunt Paul's kitchen, and Garion and Runderig, now with helmets and shields, repaired to a quiet place to do war upon each other. It was all going quite splendidly, until Runderig, who was older, taller, and stronger, struck Garion a resounding whack on the head with his wooden sword. The rim of the kettle cut into Garion's eyebrow, and the blood began to flow. There was a sudden ringing in Garion's ears, and a kind of boiling exultation surged up in his veins as he rose to his feet from the ground. He never knew afterward quite what had happened. He had only sketchy memories of shouting defiance to Kaltorak in words which sprang to his lips and which even he did not understand. Runderig's familiar and somewhat foolish face was no longer the face before him, but rather was replaced with something hideously maimed and ugly. In a fury, Garion struck at that face again and again with fire seething in his brain. And then it was over. Poor Runderig lay at his feet, beaten senseless by the enraged attack. Garion was horrified at what he had done, but at the same time there was a fiery taste of victory in his mouth. Later, in the kitchen, when all injuries on the farm were routinely taken, Aunt Paul tended their wounds with only minimal comments about them. Runderig seemed not to be seriously hurt, though his face had begun to swell and turn purple in several places, and he had difficulty focusing his eyes at first. A few cold cloths on his head and one of Aunt Paul's potions quickly restored him. The cut on Garion's brow, however, required a bit more attention. She had Dernick hold the boy down, and then she took a needle and thread and sewed up the cut as calmly as she would have repaired a rip in a sleeve, all the while ignoring the howls from her patient. All in all, she seemed much more concerned about the dented kettles and battered pot lids than about the war wounds of the 2 boys. When it was over, Garion had a headache and was taken up to bed. "At least I beat Kaltorak," he told Aunt Paul somewhat drowsily. She looked at him sharply. "Where did you hear about Torak?" she demanded. "It's Kaltorak, Aunt Paul," Garion explained patiently. "Answer me." The farmers were telling stories, old Kralto and the others, about Brand and Vomimber and Kaltorak and all the rest. That's what Runderig and I were playing. I was Brand and he was Kaltorak. I didn't get to uncover my shield, though. Runderig hit me on the head before we got that far. "I want you to listen to me, Garion," Aunt Paul said, "and I want you to listen carefully. You are never to speak the name of Torak again." "It's Kaltorak, Aunt Paul," Garion explained again, "not just Torak." Then she hit him, which she had never done before. The slap across his mouth surprised him more than it hurt, for she did not hit very hard. "You will never speak the name of Torak again. Never," she said. This is important, Garion. Your safety depends on it. I want your promise." "You don't have to get so angry about it," he said in an injured tone. "Promise." "All right, I promise. It was only a game." "A very foolish one," Aunt Paul said. "You might have killed Runderik." "What about me?" Garion protested. "You were never in any danger," she told him. "Now go to sleep." And as he dozed fitfully, his head light from his injury and the strange bitter drink his aunt had given him, he seemed to hear her deep, rich voice saying, "Garion, my Garion, you're too young yet." And later, rising from a deep sleep, as a fish rises toward the silvery surface of the water, he seemed to hear her call, "Father, I need you." Then he plunged again into a troubled sleep, haunted by a dark figure of a man on a black horse, who watched his every movement with a cold animosity and something that hovered very near the edge of fear. And behind that dark figure he had always known to be there, but never overtly acknowledged, even to Aunt Paul, the maimed and ugly face he had briefly seen or imagined in the fight with Runderik loomed darkly, like the hideous fruit of an unspeakably evil tree. Thank you for listening along with us. This book is usually available wherever your favorite books are to be found. For more chapters, see the playlist below. Like or subscribe if that's your thing. We love you like burning. Bye.